Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying day 3 of Sand. We're here talking about dying and living and how that affects us to be faced with this confrontation and conversation with death and dying. We are very excited to welcome our next speaker, Peter Russell. Peter Russell is a physicist, best-selling author, and explorer of the realms of consciousness. With having both attended the University of Cambridge, where he studied theoretical physics, experimental psychology, and computer science, he also spent time devoted to a path of meditation and philosophy in India. He offers a very unique gift of welcoming others to think outside of the box and encourages us to lean into our curiosities and fascinations with consciousness. Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you.
Yes. What I'm going to do is just pass it over to you. You and I spoke on the phone prior, and you've got something ready to come through you. So I'm just going to pass it to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yes. The aspect of dying and living that I want to talk about is not so much in terms of the body. I think we had a lot of focus on that, but another sort of dying, which is the dying of the self, the dying of the ego, which I was fascinated that the very first thing on this whole conference was Patathi Bal. When she opened, she said, if you die while living, then you fall into a river of love. And that's what I want to look at more, is the dying while living, that aspect of it. And I've called this session the blossoming of consciousness because for two reasons. One, that is the full blossoming of our consciousness, that dying while living, so we really touch into our true nature. But also I see this as an incredibly significant time on our planet in terms of the awakening of consciousness. If you look back over the whole history of this planet, life began very early on, but for most of life, for probably 99% of a life's history, we weren't here. It was only in the last 1% that, mammals evolved in about the last 1% of Earth's history. And then the last 1% of that, human beings evolved. And then in the last 1% of that, we became self-aware, aware that we are aware that we were conscious. And I think that was the big step. That was the beginning of the blossoming. I call that a sort of a budding of consciousness. There's a bud of consciousness opens on the planet. And that was when we became self-aware. And yet that form of awareness was still a limited sense of self. In that self-awareness, there's a sense of me here, individual, looking at the world, thinking, behaving, making choices, etc. It's a sense of an individual self that is aware. And what all the great spiritual traditions have pointed to is that this is a sense we're just half awake. We're only half aware. And this is the mode in which most of us function. And there's another stage, which is the full awakening of consciousness, which is when we step beyond that, what I call the ego mind. We step beyond that into our true nature. And as nearly all the teachings say, that's where we step into love, a spiritual love. And that sort of love is not something we develop so much. It's something that's there already, but our attachment to the sense of a separate self veils that form of love. And so it's more it's an uncovering of what is already there. It's an uncovering of our true nature. So that's why I see we're at this very, very critical time in human history where this is beginning to happen. You could say probably just the last 50 years, which is the last 1% of that 1% of 1% of 1%, this tiny, tiny fraction of the Earth's history, we're collectively beginning to wake up. I think there's been many teachers before over the last few thousand years who've been saying, hey, there's more than just this sense of individual self. But I think just the last 50 years or so, really, I think it started in the 60s, there's been this blossoming of consciousness on the planet of more and more people realizing that this is what we need to explore, that this is the true awakening. And that's, I think, very much behind the whole spirit of Sand, is like, we are waking up. And I say, and at the same time, in the last 50 years, it's clear we've just spiraled into a crisis, huge crisis, which, I think we're all aware of, whether it's the population, diminishing resources, increasing pollution in the atmosphere, the soil, the oceans, climate change, something that's really on our minds. And I think at this time, this particular time in history, the pandemic, we're clearly in a global crisis. So along with the global awakening, there's also this global crisis that we're in. And that there's a lot of dying that's going on there. We're having to let go of a lot of things we've held dear, and that is a sort of grieving in ourselves. I know many people I've been talking to this time with the pandemic, we're grieving the loss of things we used to be able to do, freedoms we used to have, and who knows how it's going to be in the future. And also that we're seeing the dying of other species, of environments. So that's really in the air at the same time. So we have these two things together, both this blossoming of consciousness and this crisis. And I see the two are actually closely related, because if you look back to the crisis, virtually every aspect of the crisis comes back in one way or another to human thoughts, human decisions, human values, human choices. And most of those choices come from this short-sighted, more self-centered mode of consciousness. So I see our current mode of consciousness, this what I call the half-awake stage, is actually behind the crisis. So the crisis is a call, really, for the full awakening, the full blossoming of human consciousness. So let me just say a little bit about what I call ego, the self. People talk about the ego as if there's something or some entity, some individual self that is ruling us, whatever. I don't think there's such a thing as an ego. When I look inside myself, I don't find some entity which I would label ego, or something ego. When I look inside myself, what I find is there's that sense of me, which is always present, which has been there all my life. It's that same sense of me that was there yesterday, a week ago, as far back as I can remember. That sense of me never changes. And that's what I think many of the spiritual traditions refer to as, the pure self, the pure I, the I am that is always there. But I don't find a separate other self called an ego. I mean, what I find at times I get very caught up in what I would call egocentric thinking, self-centered thinking, where I'm concerned about what I'm going to get out of this, what do people think of me, how's this going to work, or I need this, whatever it is. Some of my thinking is egocentric, but there's not actually an ego there. It's just I see it more as a pattern of thinking that we get caught into. And it's a pattern of thinking which I think our whole society reinforces. They reinforce this sense of here you are, a separate individual self. And but because it's a mode of thinking, it's not something we have to get rid of. And this is what I think is important about shifting from seeing it as some entity or thing, to just seeing it as a mode of thinking that I get caught up in. Because, well, what many traditions say is what they see as the ego is some enemy you've got to get rid of. But if it's a mode of thinking we get caught up in, then it's much easier just to be able to step out of that mode of thinking for the moment. So we can sort of drop the egoic mode at any time we want. So because it's a mode of consciousness, rather than talking about it as a thing, I often talk about it as a verb. It's like what we're doing is we're egoing. We're caught in egoing. We're caught in an egoic way of looking at things, of treating things. And it's actually a very important mode. I think it's really important to stress this, that ego gets a very bad rap. This way of thinking is there to help us survive, look after our bodies. It's there to preserve the organism. If there's some threat to our safety, our survival, if there's something we need, something that's important, if we're hungry or something, or there's some danger, it's really important that we drop into an egoic way of thinking. It's really important that we make ourselves the number one priority, because if we didn't, we die. And so its value is to keep us alive, to keep us safe, to help us survive. So in that sense, the ego mode I see as an ally. It's there to help us. The problem is, I think as most of us realize, is this way of thinking is triggered much more often than it's needed. I mean, maybe we only need to be in that way of thinking 10% of the time, but most of us get caught in that way of thinking maybe all the time, or most of the time. So what I'm interested in is how can we step out of that mode of thinking? In a sense, how can we allow that thinking to die away? And I'm not talking about it dying away forever. It's about allowing it to die away whenever it comes up, which can be many times a day. So the dying of the ego isn't something that happens sometime way off in the future when you get enlightened, the ego dissolves. It's about allowing it to dissolve anytime we get caught in it. And what I found is there's two, I find two useful ways of recognizing when we're caught in it. One is it usually has a sense of insistence to it. It knows what you should be doing. It knows what is right, this way of thinking. And that's actually quite natural, because its job is to keep us safe. And if it sees some danger or some need, something we need to do, it's important that it's insistent. You need to do this, or your safety is, you're not safe. You need to do it. So that's one way of recognizing it. When there's a voice telling us you need to do this, it may be, say, we're in a conversation with somebody and the voice starts saying, you need to tell them this, you need to make clear this. It's like, hang on, if it's being that insistent, that may be the ego mode that's talking. And another way that I find useful is there's nearly always some sort of tension in the background with it. The ego mode, it's a focus mode, it has a goal, it's concentrating on something. And so there's usually a background tension. And so I find that another useful thing. If you're finding your mind is getting a little tense, I call it constriction of consciousness. If there's that tightening of consciousness, that's a good sign that probably you're caught in this mode of what I call the egoing. So what I like to do is, it's a very simple practice, which I just like to really offer everyone here. I mean, there's many, many ways of stepping out of thinking. I mean, most meditation techniques in one way or another are about stepping out of the thinking mode, stepping out of the ego mode. And there's lots of different ways to do that. But the simplest that I found is really just when you notice that happening, just to pause that thought. When you notice you're getting caught in a thought, say the example I was saying about, you need to tell somebody this, it's really important. It's just to pause that thinking. And then to notice what happens when you pause. I mean, you can do this now as I'm talking, when you just notice your thinking. What happens when you pause your thinking? And for most people, there's this sense of, it just feels a bit lighter because that tension goes. There's often a sense of relief, and it just feels easier. And that's a sign that we're sort of coming back more to ourselves. And so this is something which actually you can do any time of day, which is what I like about it. Any time of day when it occurs to you, or you're reminded of it, you can just choose to just pause your thinking for a moment. And then the important thing that I find is to notice how it feels when you pause the thinking. Notice that sense of whatever it is, sense of lightness, relief, ease. Sometimes there's a greater sense of quietness or stillness. And then to enjoy it, to savor it. I find this is also really important, just to take a moment to enjoy how it feels when you step out of the egoing. Enjoy how it feels. And that then becomes something that reinforces the process. It's like, oh, yes, it does feel good to do this. And so that becomes a motivation to remember to do it and to do it more often. So I call that just this the savoring how it feels. And I think it's important also to be able to do this more and more often, just drop back into ourself, to drop back into a quieter, still state. In fact, the more you do this, the more you begin to recognize that sense of stillness, which is always there. Because I think in the times we're in, the chaos we're in, it's really valuable to be able to just touch back into that inner stillness that's there. And what we're doing, I talk about the self, we're touching back into what I call our authentic self. And I don't mean here, the true self that non-dualist teachers talk about, that pure self. I'm talking about our individual personality, which is like, I call it the authentic self because it's how we are when we're not caught up in the ego mode. We're not caught up in worry or fear or concern or judgment or whatever it is, or even excitement about what we're going to get, what's going to happen. All those things sort of veil our true self. They're not really who we are. The authentic self is where we just get in touch with our own inner sense of wisdom that's there. So I often call this the natural mind. It's how we are when we're not worried, when we're not upset, when we're not angry, when we're not fearful, when we're not trying to get something. There's just this natural state of mind, which is actually one of just natural contentment. We create for ourselves a lot of discontent. The ego mind creates discontent about how it thinks, this isn't right, I need to do this, I need to get that. So what we're doing when we allow it just to die away is we're just coming back to how we naturally are without the judgment, the worry, the grievance, etc. And that, I think from that place, we can be much more understanding of other people. When we're seeing other people free of our own egoic needs and things, when we see other people as they are, then I think from that comes compassion, comes understanding, compassion. And as I said, where we started, we drop into that, what Patati Bar was talking about, we drop into that river of love. We touch into the love that's always there. And so what we're doing here is basically we're becoming more alive. When we're caught in the egoing mode, we're not so alive. We're conditioned to follow its thinking. It tends to be a mode of thinking which is, as I said, full of discontent. But when we drop back into our authentic self, we become more alive. We become more free to follow our true nature, follow what we really are being called to do in this world. So, and that I see as that is our own full blossoming. That is the full blossoming of our own consciousness. That becoming free of the ego mind, allowing it to die and becoming free of it. And as I've been saying, it's not something that happens and that's it. It's a practice. It's a process which we can do many, many, many times a day. As I say, just whenever you notice you're caught up in an egoic way of thinking, just to pause the thinking and notice how it feels and savor it. So I don't know I think that's probably all I have to say for the moment. But Katie, if you have any
Beautiful.
questions you'd like to explore, or if other people have any questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for, want to really acknowledge my gratitude for you speaking about the planet and the oceans and the earth and the species that are going extinct. I think that is something, in the same way that we are apprehensive to look towards the reality of death and to confront it. I think there's a lot of also, in partly from our culture and society, encouraging us to not look at the death of what's going on around us because it is so overwhelming. And I think potentially it brings us to a sincere place of compassion, which would then bring us to a more conscious state, and we would stop doing what is creating so much harm.
Mm.
I'm curious, when we see what's going on around us, I'll try to relay this question and articulate it. When we see what's going on around us, like you mentioned, a lot of us are feeling grief. Um, and that grief may bring this emotional response within us that we feel helpless, we feel sad, we feel afraid. And then we see what's going on with the planet. Yet there's also this birthing of consciousness, this awareness. In a sense, we have to grieve in order to reach that full, like, blossoming expansion of consciousness, to reach the halfway point to the full point. What would you say about that, in that little area of where we're feeling sincere grief, looking at what's going on, the sincere sadness, yet, like, that is necessary in order for us to get to the next place?
Yeah.
Does that make
I,
sense?
yes, yes, definitely. And I think I know, as some other speakers have been saying in this conference, it's really important to allow the grieving, to experience it. And I think what we tend to do with uncomfortable emotions, because they're uncomfortable, we don't want to experience them. So we tend to push them away, push them to the back, not get into them, and go off and, "Oh, I'm going to do something else, which I feel a lot better. I'm going to do something to make me feel better." But I think, as all, the great wise people of all time have said, it's important to get into these things, allow them in. So if there's grief, I mean, there's two ways to allow it in. One is, what am I feeling in my body? Where is it? What's happening? Is it a feeling of, sadness, or wanting to cry? Is it a feeling of tension somewhere? It can be different things, but just to tune in. How does it feel in my body, the grieving? What's going on in my body? 'Cause it's something we don't look to, because we're so busy doing things. So just to pause and just feel into what's happening in the body, but also to look at what the story is we're telling ourselves, what's going on in our thinking about it, because the two get wrapped up together. But I think, in short, it's really important to allow the grieving in, and to give it its space. It's really important, because it's true. We are human beings, and the grieving is a truth that we need to listen to. We need to experience. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think, like you said, we are so easy to turn away from it and try to be happy and feel joy and look in another direction. Yet it's oftentimes that is it's our turning away, and all of the rest of what is giving us this temporary sense of joy and fulfillment that is actually destroying the planet.
Right.
So I think what you're saying is to lean into the truth, to look at it, to not be afraid of it, to embrace it, to feel it, to breathe into it. I'm curious. I want to ask one more question and then open it up for others to ask some questions. You coined the term global brain, and where my mind goes is hive mind. I think of, we raise bees at my house on our land, and I think of bees. I think of this hive mind of shared consciousness. And that term, I think, was probably applicable to technology and computerization and the World Wide Web. But when I think about us at this point, you've mentioned in your work that we may be at a point where there's no turning back, or we've done a lot of destruction. What do you see as being a functional, constructive way for us to enter into the hive mind of consciousness, to do anything, if there is something we can do to awaken a solution and the health of our planet rather than the destruction? How can you speak to global mind with consciousness?
Right. Okay. Thank you. It's going to be a whole lot of talk. Um, when I wrote The Global Brain, which was 50 years ago, no, 40 years ago, I was looking at the very early stages of computer networking. I've been working in computer networks myself, and I could see that the future of computing was not in larger and larger computers, but in the actual linking together of computers. And I saw this, we were like the nerve cells of the global brain and beginning to link us together. This was before the internet existed as such. And here we are, nearly 50 years later, and it's happening. I mean, here we are. This this event is taking place across the world. We are with each other. Here I am, in some sense, with you in person, although our bodies are separated a long way. So it's happening, and it's happening faster and faster. This linking together of consciousness, and that's what I said. It's not so much the linking together of people, but the linking together of consciousnesses. So my mind is communicating with your mind here. That's what's happening. How do we come together more in a sense of a more universal way of thinking? I think this is what you're pointing to. I think it's really what I was talking about. It's stepping back from all the things that keep us trapped in our own me, here, separate self, competing against other selves, competing against the world. The more we can step out of that and touch into what I call, more our true nature, I think we're going to find the wisdom to know how we can each respond in a way that is supporting the collective, supporting the planet, supporting humanity as a whole, and supporting other species, which is really coming from love. What we were talking about earlier, it's coming from compassion. So I see the basics in principle is, again, stepping out of our egoic mode of thinking and coming back to our authentic self, so that we can make decisions that come from wisdom and compassion. And in saying that, I don't want to prescribe this is what we must do in terms of action, because I don't know what's the best action collectively. It's like we're all called to act in different ways. And I think what is important is that we, in a sense, free ourselves to follow our own calling, and trusting that if it's coming out of that place of openness, wisdom, and love, whatever we choose to do is going to be in harmony with what other people are choosing to do, coming from that place. So I think it's that principle that's important, rather than saying we must all do this. It's like we must each step back into our authentic self, and then from there we can make the best decisions we can make about how we act in our own individual lives.
Beautiful. So what I gather from that is you mentioned wisdom, and I imagine intuition, that mycelial network that connects all of us, that we open ourselves up to that for the communication to happen. Yeah. The more that we bring that in individually. So yeah. Powerful. Yeah. Peter, I want to welcome someone else into the conversation to ask you a question. Andrew Bishop, it looks like you have your hand raised. Would you like to join the conversation?
Okay. I didn't expect to be. Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi. I really didn't expect to be first, but all right. Peter, I really love that, and you reminded me of Alan Watts with the noun becoming a verb with egoing. I thought that was terrific. I like that concept. Tension, as you were talking about, and Katie, you were talking about it too, leaning into the tension. I really get that. I had a very ego dissolving experience recently, and it was a lot of tension I had to lean into. Feeling a bit of it now. One thing, I was talking to a lady yesterday, and she was talking about traditional funeral rites where they would spend 10 days grieving the death of someone. And it reminded me of the Chinese, tradition of cleaning the gravestones once a year. I wanted to know your thoughts on rites of passage. Cultural rites of passage is kind of a collective leaning into the tension. What your thought is of that?
Yes. I think they're really important, and something which in our contemporary, more materialistic culture, we've let drop. And we just like, oh, let's have a funeral, get it over with, bury the person or whatever it is. It's like, move on. And I think, most indigenous cultures, or even, earlier versions of our own culture, there was much more of that, both the celebrating of the person, the Irish wake, celebrating their life. There's the mourning, there's the grieving, but also there's celebrating. I mean, I like something, Francis Weller, who was speaking, I know earlier, one of his lines that I love is, grieving shows us what we love. So I think part of that process should be the loving, the celebrating what we love about the person, as well as the mourning of the loss, that the two go together. But yeah, I think it's really, really important that we have a lot more, we bring that back into our culture. Really important. Because it's through that, and I'm talking, earlier to Katie's question, we need to allow the experience of the grieving. And I think, that having some, whatever it is, ritual or something, allows it in. I mean, I know recently, not so recently, but several years ago, when I lost a close friend, I went through the, somewhat of the grieving and the loss, but it was when we actually had his memorial service sometime later that I just found myself bursting out in tears at the memorial service, because it was in that service that something just touched me, that the grieving really came pouring out. Wasn't it, at the time of his death, it was a shock and I was in shock, but it was in the service that I was able to really mourn his departure.
Wow, powerful. Thank you so much. That was a really good question, Andrew. I think it really speaks to what we were talking about, the collective coming together. And I imagine maybe in the memorial you had permission, there was a connective field of everyone resonating at the same frequency, and that's powerful.
Yeah, something like that. It was sort of unexpected, and I just, we're then driving afterwards to having a sort of meal and things. I just found myself just sobbing in the car, and it wasn't anything that was said or anything. The service wasn't particularly remarkable, but it's just having that space allowed me to touch into it just created a space where I could touch into what was going on inside me, which I hadn't touched into before, not fully.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. Rites of passage. Joyce Moore, it looks like you have your hand up. Would you like to join the circle? Join the conversation?
Yes.
There you are.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Peter, I have to tell you, I have been a groupie for as long as I can remember. So thank you for being here. I thank COVID, because without it, I live in the Great Northeast, and the opportunity to attend SAND conference was 0 to none. And here I am, and I'm talking to Peter Russell. So yeah, for a long time, I've led an online Sangha group for 13 years, and some of the elders didn't see it as authentic practice because, it wasn't real, because we were doing it on the internet. So COVID is teaching us this too, because suddenly they're holding online retreats. So it's just been wonderful. Peter, if I could ask a question. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the collective being in the individual and the individual being in the collective, so that anything I think, do, or say becomes part of that collective, which gives me a sense of responsibility. When asked about, how to kill the ego one time, he assured the inquirer that there's nothing to kill. And recently I heard someone, and his name escapes me, I will remember it, he called it a narrative center of gravity. It's a story that becomes our center, and we tend to spin right along with it. But there's also another thing, and this comes back to our subject today. There's the passing, there is the death of ancestors that I do not know. And yet sometimes there's a heaviness in my heart, and I feel a great sadness that I know is old. it's ancient and it's coming down from my ancestors. So what would you say is a way we can cultivate the understanding of suffering we may be feeling, loss, death, however you want to put it, coming to us from ancestors whose nose may be in the center of my face, but I've never known them, nor they me. Thank you for listening.
Again, I think this is personal for each of us in our own way, but I think the principle there again is what I was saying about grieving is to, when you're feeling this, is to allow yourself to almost soak in the feeling, what is here, because often these feelings are sort of percolating beneath the surface, and we're picking up bits of them. It's like a faint radio station, and you pick up bits of the voices, and it's like we need to stop and tune into what's happening here. So just being, I would say, being quiet, being in a quiet place, allowing the mind to settle down and be quiet, and then say, what's going on here, with an attitude of curiosity. What's here? Because I think this is where it begins to reveal itself, and whatever is going on in terms of the ancestors, whatever it is, our past, can begin to show us and can begin to teach us, and we can begin to work with that. But first of all, we have to really pause to let it in. So rather than sort of jumping to decide what to do about it immediately, is recognize that what you're doing is probably just picking up the surface of it. And so just choose to be quiet and go deeper within, not without any agenda, but just like saying, okay, what's here? Just be curious, what's here? And just see what reveals itself. That's what I would suggest, to see what reveals itself to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Beautiful question, Joyce. Peter, we have just a couple of minutes left. Joan, I want to unmute you so you can ask your question, but it's sincere brevity at this point. So if you feel like you can ask the question and sum it up.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I really liked your focus on recognizing egoing in the practice of pausing. It reminded me a lot of mindfulness and that practice. And do you see any difference between what you're talking about, pausing and dropping into one's authentic self, and mindfulness practice?
Subtle differences, but they're all in the same family. Yeah, of just becoming aware of what there is in the present. What I was suggesting is an approach. Mindfulness is a very similar approach, but they're all in the same family of approaches.
Good, thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for joining us. We're nearing the end of your talk. What beautiful wisdom. I think that you gave us a lot of tools to work with, a lot of tips. It feels very functional, like it wasn't just a thought to leave us curious, but curious with tools to actually take action. Do you have anything you'd like to direct us towards as far as your work or a place to find you online?
You can find me online at my website, which is peterrussell.com. Russell with 2 L's, else you get somebody else's site. But peterrussell.com, and I've got lots of writings, my books, videos, meditations, lots of stuff there.
Oh, beautiful. If you just want to show, I don't know if you can see all of us, but if you just want to show your hands and let Peter know your gratitude, you can also give him thanks in the chat. Peter, we are surrounding you in thanks and gratitude, and thank you so much for bringing your work and your amazing energy to Sand and to us today.
Lovely. Thank you. It's been really enjoyed being with you, Katie. Thank you, and with everybody.
Thank you, Peter.